All right, it's my pleasure to moderate this panel on communication and mathematics of planet Earth. And I'm really excited about this panel. We've really got a wide array of expertise here. And as Fred mentioned earlier, this panel actually came about because it was a theme that just popped up again and again in all the workshops leading up to this workshop. So without further ado, I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. We're going to start on this end with Scott Kolb.
Hi, I'm Scott Culp. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the computational scientist at Climate Central in the Sea Level Rise program. So basically, what we're interested in Climate Central is we feel that there's a large gap between what the scientific community understands about climate change and the importance of mitigating the effects of climate change versus what the general public and policymakers understand. And so what we do at Climate Central is try to bridge this gap. About half of our team are scientists, including myself, and we try to analyze the impacts and effects of climate change in the US and globally, and publish in journals and present at conferences. And then the other half of our organization are journalists who take our analysis and papers and translate them into something that the public can more easily digest. Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess while my slides are coming up, I'll introduce myself. I'm Joanne Logan. I'm here at the University of Tennessee. I'm over on the other campus, the College of Thank you. Perfect. College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources. I've been here a long time. I teach over in environmental and soil sciences, but I'm also the undergraduate director. So I'm very involved with like SACS accreditation, and we do have communication as two of our main outcomes on our SACS accreditation that we still really struggle with, figuring out a good way of measuring it and figuring out how well the students are doing with it. But the thing I was going to point out today, because I think I'm coming from a little different, I'm not a mathematician, although I actually like math, unlike most of my students who mostly don't like math. They kind of go running. We get some engineering washouts in environmental sciences, but we just get a lot of students that really like science, they tell me, but they don't like math so much. So I thought I would just run through just a few things about the math issues that we're having, with the idea that perhaps you guys could, down the road, give us some feedback or maybe include it in your report about what can we do to improve the situation with math communications in fields like mine, environmental science, because we really do struggle with this. I've stopped faculty in the hall all week asking them questions about, what's the main reason students flub up on the exams or the homework, and 9 times out of 10 it's because they can't do the math. So this is something we really, really struggle with. Here I've just got some example questions that we use. I mean, we have tons and tons of applications. I don't know if math teachers ever use any of these in their instruction. I have to admit that my faculty and myself, we're just as guilty of not communicating with you guys about the kinds of needs that or expectations we have for our students. But, these are all definitely planet Earth questions. These are things that are preventing fertilizer runoff, and causing eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico. It's pollution modeling and gas transport modeling and sediment modeling, water pollution, lots of really important topics for planet Earth that we do expect our students to be able to use some math for. And we're just really, it's getting worse and worse. I hate to admit it, but it is. So these are just some examples. You mentioned Climate Central. I wish I could borrow him for tonight, because we're talking about sea level rise in class tonight. That would be great. But, these should look pretty familiar to all of you, of course, and they probably would make complete sense to you. And you think, well, not very high-level math. Our students struggle with these. This is just some examples of some very easy problems that we would expect a student to be able to, either use or also communicate with the public as they're talking about things like textual analyses. Probably at the top question, about 25% of our students would struggle with that one. By the time you get down to the bottom, it's almost 100%. And So you can just see kind of this transition from easier problems to more difficult problems. And, you know, a lot of it is just basic algebra or trig, and they're just really, really having issues with them. And so when they're trying to communicate to the public using some sort of quantitative information, a lot of times they don't understand it very well, and it makes it very difficult for them to communicate to the public or to their employers if they're having to do that. And then the last, this is kind of I got the faculty to summarize. They hate word problems still. It still hasn't gotten any better in our field. They really struggle with word problems. Exponents, order of operation, if you can believe it, they're still struggling with that one. Trig functions, multi-step problems, unit conversions, and this can even be in the same units. So like, you know, saying like metric units or linear. It's not even like necessarily converting from metric to linear. It's just doing unit conversions in metric system. Mental math. I have a question on my exam tonight where they're having to calculate the energy emitted by a body, and they have to take the fourth power of a number and multiply it by a coefficient. You can easily do this in your head, but you can be darn tootin'. Every single one of them will have a calculator out tonight because they just can't seem to do the mental math. And so they really rely on their calculators and their phones a lot. And pretty much any math related to chemistry or physics, they just can't do it. So I think in terms of communication, this is really important because I think our students need to master this to be able to help. Because I know mathematicians, you guys need to communicate, but also the applied sciences is so important for us to be incorporating mathematics and incorporating it in our messages. And our students are running from this. They are just terrified of doing anything with math. And so I'm looking for help. Okay? Thanks.
I think it's the same one, so yeah, check it out. Hi, my name is Olivia Walsh. I am a math PhD student at the University of Michigan. I study the mathematics of sleep and circadian rhythms. This is one of the cells I study that I 3D printed right here. Since this is a communications panel, I wanted to mention that a big part of my research now is deploying mathematical models through mobile applications. Here's the first app I made, a few screenshots. It's been downloaded 120,000 times. We've had people around the world submit their data back to us. So like 10,000 users have done that. And it's a great opportunity for citizen science. But I'm also going to talk about my side career as a cartoonist. I am a semi-professional cartoonist. My clients include the World Bank, the Washington Post, and I also use it a lot in teaching. And so I have my students draw cartoons, I draw cartoons, and a lot of what I'm going to maybe talk about today, if you guys are interested, is this notion of applied cartooning. And so this is an excerpt from the Applied Cartooning Manifesto. The idea is people like cartoons, people pay attention to cartoons, cartoonists are starving, let's collaborate with them for the good of all. And I really recommend looking this up. I think this is something that can really help us communicate better. So thank you.
So I'm Larissa DeSantis, and I'm also not a mathematician, but I use math in my teaching and sort of everyday work. I'm mainly a paleoecologist, and I look at how mammals have responded to climate change over the past. I'm heavily reliant on mathematicians. Part of what I do is look at the textural properties of food, and we use scale-sensitive fractal analysis to do all of that work. But the main reason I'm here is because I have a history of working with K-12 schools, with doing outreach as part of museums. I used to drive this 38-foot Winnebago in New York City, which was a challenge in of itself, and bring exhibits to school groups about paleontology. I also have worked on exhibits like this Megalodon exhibit, which is the largest shark that ever lived, and trying to make it sort of increase inquiry-based activities, including simple sort of calculations and trying to figure out how much Megalodon ate in terms of number of tuna cans per day, or how old it was by looking at counting the rings on their centra. So one of the things I wanted to sort of make a point about is that math can be can be compelling. So I teach an introductory course called Ecology, Evolution, and Climates Through Time, and we read Tony Bernowski's book Heatstroke, which if you haven't read is a fantastic read. But one of the things he talks about is, or one of the things he does is communicates mathematical concepts in sort of simple language, like species-area relationships. And he also talked about sort of the amount of net primary productivity that humans are using, and the sort of calculations that have been done, which have figured out that we will use all net primary productivity when we reach about 20 billion people, which means no other species on Earth can use any of it, and that's us taking all of it. And this simple sort of calculation was really effective in students sort of thinking about population growth in my classroom. So 1 + 1 = 2 is not controversial. Climate change and evolution are, especially in places like Tennessee. And so math can be a really powerful tool for communicating concepts about the Earth in a sort of less controversial framework. Students are pretty secure in basic mathematical principles, or at least accepting them, whether they have the skills or not. And so this was by far the most effective teaching tool in changing the student's viewpoint the whole semester. So just sort of a side, not career, but I was sort of became pretty involved in what recently happened in the state of Tennessee, where they passed a piece of legislation that encourages teachers to teach the scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses of evolution, global warming, the chemical origins of life, and human cloning, and worked with the National Center for Science Education in sort of trying to combat this, and it wasn't so successful. So one thing we do have to think about is teachers have a hard time wanting to take a math problem, relate it to climate change, and teach that when they're going to get parental pushback when they are even mentioning climate change, and when tenure is not even guaranteed in most states, or they've gotten rid of tenure. So those are some considerations to think about. Even my husband, who is a biology teacher and is accepting of evolution and climate change, is terrified of sort of doing comparative anatomy labs that include fossils and whatnot, because we need to put food on the table. And so lastly, I think I just wanted to show sort of an example. These are all examples from students in my introductory class, and they come from education disciplines in the Peabody School, where they put together lesson plans about periods in Earth's history, activity guides. One of my favorites is a children's book about a particular PNAS paper. This student was a history major, and he had to understand the paper and then communicate it in a way that rhymed, which I thought was incredibly impressive. And I think one thing we can do as educators is teach our students how to communicate. They're going to learn more in that process, but they're also going to be able to sort of be that power force to sort of change minds as they become head of construction firms or CEOs at different companies, even outside of the sciences. And I don't know that we have time, but I don't know if I can hit play. This is just a fun example of a student who, maybe I can click it on here, of a student who was a talented singer, won an NBC Sing-Off, and communicated a concept that's not particularly interesting, at least to most folks, which is the C4 grassland expansion. And he made it into a fun sort of song.
Guess it's true, there's a change you must understand. Over time, a type of plant got the upper hand. C4 plants started to expand because of low CO2 or the air and land. Oh, in the Miocene, all the grass was green. The C4 plants replaced C3 in the Miocene. How did all the plant eaters deal? Yeah. When they couldn't eat the same type of forest meal. The teeth changed and the fossil now revealed. They adapted quite well to the whole ordeal.
Hello. And I'm not going to sing, so I'll spare you. I'm Katherine Crawley. I'm the communications manager here at NIMBioS. So I do all the internal and external communications for the Institute, and that includes our print media and websites and all other public relations efforts. I also do media training for our postdocs and graduate students at the University of Tennessee. And I'm really coming at this from a sort of journalist and public information officer angle because I've been involved in media for more than 20 years. But I do have some experience in the classroom. I have a master's degree in education from Vanderbilt, and I have taught English in the classroom and also journalism courses. But my PhD is in science communication. So, and I've been here at the Institute since we began and really got our website underway, and we've really built quite a large our communication efforts and our websites. So that's really my background.
Hello. So I'm Barbara Cousins, and we kind of talked about this, and I mentioned it briefly, but first I have to apologize. Microphones kind of intimidate me. I'm much more used to communicating on a bar stool, as we talked about in Berkeley at the conference. But I am Midge's daughter. I am not a mathematician. In fact, I feel woefully underbrained in this crowd. I am the daughter of two mathematicians, though, which I don't necessarily think conveyed any mathematical skills, but it certainly conveyed its fair share of crazy. I work at the moment. I spent 10 years at the World Bank and then got a wild hair and moved to the West, specifically to the rural West, and currently work across 9 Western states on energy policy. But specifically, I am considered, I guess you could say, if any such thing exists, an expert in Wyoming. And to give you just a teeny tiny primer on Wyoming, it's sort of ground zero for a lot of what's happening in environmental policy. In fact, we're seeing things happen in the rural West that we haven't seen from an environmental policy perspective since the 1970s. If you open any news source at any point in time, you're going to hear about sage grouse, congressional budget riders to prevent listing of sage grouse, congressional delisting of gray wolves, energy, the oil apocalypse currently going on, public lands issues. We have Bundy and his great standoff in Nevada. And then specifically in Wyoming, speaking about what you guys are talking about here, we also have a couple of key things that our legislature has done. One is SF-12, Senate File 12 this year passed, which criminalized citizen science. And then we also have, we have had, or 2 years ago, 2 legislative sessions, the legislature prohibited educators from teaching quote-unquote unproven topics such as evolution and climate change because the science wasn't there for them to support it. So part of what I do, just to give you a kind of quick and dirty, I'm definitely quite a bit different than anyone in this room. I am, number one, a registered lobbyist, which I think officially, biologists consider me a biostitute, which is an unfortunate characterization. Legislators call me a snappy-dressed cougar. So, but really, realistically, what I do is I sort of work at this nexus of the governor, legislators, federal agencies, and scientists, and help them sort of interpret each other's viewpoints. My partner calls me, I don't know if you've seen the comedian who's Obama's anger interpreter. I'm kind of the Western interpreter, and I jump between these different factions. I'm flying between DC and Cheyenne almost weekly and trying to help kind of negotiate some agreements and help people understand each other's perspectives. And I thought really long and hard from our time in Berkeley together and now today in terms of what I feel some of the critical skill sets in terms of communicating as scientists to policymakers, to folks who are criminalizing citizen science. is something that I never saw taught, certainly when I was an undergraduate at the ripe old age of 46. I know we're not ever supposed to admit how old we are. I stupidly made a decision to go back to graduate school at Duke. As my partner asked, was I drunk when I made that decision? I think maybe, given how bad a decision it is now in retrospect. But I'm also seeing this now in graduate school, a critical skill that I think is missing and would really be helpful to people in terms of understanding this nexus is what I call audience analysis. I think as communicators, I at least learned when I was young, I thought I was a phenomenal communicator. I think I was probably a better litigator. Communication is bidirectional, and I think we're not learning. We're talking about how to get our messages out, but we're not understanding the filters by which those messages are interpreted. And I think that requires a skill in audience analysis. And I would challenge educators at the K-12 level, undergraduate, graduate school, mid-career, I would challenge them to weave in this concept of audience analysis into what you're teaching and helping your students understand how to frame those messages in terms of how they're going to be interpreted. I'll just give a really, really brief example that came up in the Berkeley meeting is we talked about why the legislature criminalized the discussion of climate change in education. And, I think people on the coast, certainly people at Duke, say, oh, it's because they're rednecks and they're idiots and they just don't understand the science. The reality is it has nothing to do with that. The reality is that Wyoming has a population of 500,000 people per mile, only 5 people per square mile. It is number 50 in the country in population, but number 1 in terms of gas use. The reason number 1 in terms of gas use is because nobody is anywhere near each other. Everything's an hour and a half apart. We're number 1 in the country in natural gas and in coal production, number 4 in natural gas. So if we're talking about climate as this pending apocalypse that they have to be worried about, they're framing it in their mind in terms of the very real apocalypse of what would happen if the oil and gas or extractive industries sectors were more regulated than they are today. So from their perspective, they'd rather gamble on this huge apocalypse that's coming, that's been warned to them for years and years and years. And there's a lot of debate on the science in terms of we've come a long way in framing that debate. But they know for a fact if we started regulating extractive industries any more so than they are, that there would be a very real economic apocalypse in that state, and it would affect everybody. So it's not that they don't believe in science. It's not that they don't believe in climate change. It's that we have to start to understand those filters and figure out how to frame those messages so they're not divisive, so they're not threatening, and so that we can start to talk. And I've talked to scientists in the state of Wyoming about how important it is sometimes to deconstruct cause and effect and stop finding the blame. And so one of the things we do with climate that's been extremely successful, we never say the word climate change, but we talk about desertification, we talk about invasive species, we talk about all of the various impacts that they agree on unilaterally, but we never talk about climate. And as far as citizen science, I'm in the process of trying to get funded on a citizen science project led by ranchers, and one of the first things I'm going to do is lobby for an amendment to that bill so that we can hopefully get that done. So, I mean, there's ways around some of these quote-unquote center of the country, high plains, redneck theories, and, part of it is, again, communication, I think, is central to that. Sorry, I went way too long. I apologize.
Not at all, actually. Barbara got us started on sort of something I wanted to kick off this panel with, which is what are the communication skills that mathematicians need to communicate these issues? So audience analysis sounds like a very important and interesting one. I'd like to see if any of the other panelists want to contribute an idea. Thanks.
I think it really depends on what your goals are and who you're really communicating with. If you're in an academic context, I feel the communication skills for mathematicians are not totally unlike other fields, like writing high-quality papers and presenting at conferences and workshops and universities. It gets more interesting when you want to start communicating at like a public context, like trying to get your work out to the general public. because the fact is the general public will not read your journal papers and will not come to your conference presentations. What you really need to start doing at that context is becoming comfortable with reaching out to the media and reaching out to New York Times or Newsweek or any of those other outlets, and being comfortable with doing interviews with journalists and providing them with really clear and down to earth you might have to produce new figures for more general audiences rather than a scientific audience. We also find that developing interactives, like web interactives, which are a lot more expensive to develop, the web interactives are where we see, millions of hits. That's what are really, really popular with the general audience. So, right, I would say the more difficult communication skills that mathematicians need to work on if they want to communicate with the public are really the media relations skills.
The one example I can think of from environmental science, because my students come out and they're like right on the bleeding edge of working in planet Earth issues. I mean, they're right out there. They do work with a lot of regulations, and they work with a lot of businesses, development businesses, and I always think that, math, quantitative stuff would be really helpful for them to make their cases instead of just seeming like they're always holding the stick, saying you've got to comply, stormwater regulations, aerosol regulations, whatever. I think that for my students, that's been a real struggle for them, is communicating with businesses and developers, which tend to be, a little more on the right than on the left. And so sometimes it makes it really hard for them to understand the importance of the regulation, and it's a constant fight about them. And so I think that's been, for my students, a real problem in communications.
So the first rule of getting attention on the internet, the first commandment, is put a picture on it, because I think digital natives, and most of my students I would classify now as digital natives, have been conditioned to expect images as their primary input. And so I think coming up with compelling visual representations of your research, be it in math or science, is so important. And then we talked a little bit earlier about how there's a lot of fear in interdisciplinary research, just looking stupid. And I think math comes with a lot of that fear. I mean, math anxiety. And of course, there's also high emotions associated with a lot of the science we're going to be talking about with planet Earth. So humor can really help deflate those two things. And I know this is kind of the answer you'd expect from the cartoonists, used pictures and humor, but I think it bears mentioning.
So I have two sort of points. I mean, one is the obvious, which is really practicing speaking sort of a more common language. And I know that from my own personal experience, riding in a taxi and explaining why I was at a place doing what I was doing, or I stayed at a bed and breakfast once while working on a confocal microscope. And around the table were all lawyers in for a conference, and they sort of said, well, what are you doing? And having to explain why I was looking at the surfaces of teeth and why that was important, and why it could tell something about extinction and climate change and these things, and being able to articulate it. I also think from the math perspective, one of the best classes I've ever taken was at University of Florida, taught by Bob Holt, which some of you may know. And I was always so impressed how he could take a incredibly complicated equation and communicate it in such simple, eloquent language. And I finally understood why and how he was able to do that. We stayed in touch, and he's from Tennessee, and so happened to stop by our house one day with his mom. And, we got in a conversation, and all of a sudden, he would kind of turn and he would communicate it. And so constantly, on an everyday basis, he is communicating in a common language, and it's something that we can do more in our teaching. And the last thing, just to second the point you made about talking with the media, I think one skill that across the board mathematicians and scientists have little to no experience with is formal training of how to talk with the media. And I had none. And so, I would ask a question and I would answer that question. I was asked another question, I'd answer that question, and I didn't really understand sort of the points. And one of the things with climate change is, many times they'll ask, okay, is this blizzard because of climate change? And the answer all scientists will give is, well, this particular event can't be attributed to climate change. Well, that's one of the sort of worst answers we can give. And as part of a program called Discourse, which was funded by NSF and I think other organizations, they sort of threw all of us into a room, social scientists, geologists, ecologists, made us talk the same language. We all had climate change in common, and also gave us media training. And one of the things they really hammered in is flip that question around and say, with climate change, we expect more extreme weather events. And this is in line with that expectation. That completely changes how that sort of conversation is then going to go from there on. But also to have talking points, right? Have 3 talking points, identify them beforehand, come back to those talking points. So whether you're talking about a paper that you just published or you're giving commentary on some event that's happened, always making sure you come back to those points. And that simple, hour session on how to talk to the media, I think has really changed how I talk to the media and other folks who are a part of that program.
Yeah, these are all really good points. I would just add analogies are always a good thing. So while you're communicating that and appealing to the analytical processing side of the brain, and you've got your data and your models, also remember more the experiential processing side of the brain, where you're appealing more to emotion, you're using stories and vivid images. And one of the ways to do that is to come up with a good metaphor. I heard one just the other day actually on NPR. There is a national push right now to reduce food waste, and apparently we waste 133 billion pounds of food every year. All right, so that's a number. But somebody said that the equivalent to that is it could fill up 42 Sears Towers. So that person got it. There is an analogy there that works. It's very vivid. So any opportunity to do that, if you can get your students to do that, yourselves to do that when you speak to media, if you have that opportunity, think about a good metaphor that's going to work.
I wanted to see if people in the audience had questions for this panel.
Some of the things you're talking about aren't even issues of communicating with the media and then the public, but actually with other scientists. One issue you guys have brought up, where I sit, we actually discretize the mathematical equations and put them in the model and run the climate model. So we're at the very beginning of the chain of different things that happen in building the models, running the models, analyzing the models, publishing the papers, and then at the very end, where the media comes in. Climate scientists don't understand the limitations of the models that we're making. We always make assumptions in our equations. And so on the mathematics side, I feel like we're not even doing a good job. Some of the papers we mentioned, like I would want to have a debate about this issue of a blizzard not having a relationship to climate change. Sometimes it doesn't, and it goes back into, well, our models didn't resolve them, or there's a complicated discussion which probably can't happen with the public, but actually about discussing these things, it's a lot of papers get published that refer to things in our models that really they're not able to do, and there's not even an understanding of that. So I guess my question to you is, before we even talk about talking to the media, how do we talk among scientists from the more mathematical to the less so about you can use the models for this, but not that, and don't change this parameter or it's no longer valid, things like that. Thank you.
Advice from the panel?
We'll let them address that first. I don't know the question.
Say that many of the same communication skills that you would use with the media, you would also need to use with your fellow scientists as well. Trying to find a common language, it's difficult to do. Yes, it's a challenge. But it's all knowing all the basic communication skills. Know your audience. Try to avoid using technical language, getting bogged down in jargon. So you can find some common ground to have that conversation. It's very similar skills across all disciplines.
I was just going to piggyback on that. I think one thing, communicating and doing interdisciplinary research is sort of high risk, high reward, but more high risk especially for early career folks. And I think one thing we need to do is incentivize that communication. So it's really hard to learn another language or even to learn to communicate amongst each other. And it's worth doing when there's going to sort of be a payoff, right? And so I think there are two things we can do is one, as funding opportunities incentivize collaborations across disciplines, especially as funding has gotten so tight, that's sort of one way that I think, a university is very happy when you bring in these sort of larger grants, and that's one way of sort of justifying this research that you yourself may be excited about doing anyways. But I also think that there's a fundamental issue with the whole promotion part of it, publishing in more interdisciplinary journals. I know publishing in PLOS One, if you look at the blogs, and I face some myself, can be career suicide, and is it? But yet it's that journal that gets out to everybody, right? It gets out to the social scientists and the ecologists and the climate scientists and the mathematicians. And so is that a risk that's worth taking? But we need to sort of think about the things that are also barriers to learning that other language, to sort of jumping outside of our comfort zone and try to incentivize interdisciplinary work as well.
Necessarily. So I've had some interesting discussions with people about reluctance to talk to the public and to the media and to politicians about climate change, because that would put you in the position of seeming like an advocate for something, and that might jeopardize your ability to claim that you're neutral. In order to be an effective scientist, you should be neutral. So does anybody want to address that issue?
Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. I've actually had a lot of discussions lately with politicians and legislators, both at the federal and state level, about this notion of scientists as advocates. And I think it's definitely a challenging gray area we're in right now. And I think one of the ways I have seen scientists be really effective advocates in terms of just offering pure, unfiltered, uncorrupted data for a specific thing. But I think when we use politicized language, we start falling down a slope that potentially leads to an advocacy moniker. So my theory, and it goes back to this deconstruction and looking at language, and I mean, obviously climate change has unfortunately suffered a branding problem. So I think scientists can talk about extreme weather events, desertification, invasive species, forest health, all of these things very effectively because those are not politicized topics and they're bipartisan in nature. There is unilateral bipartisan support for addressing these issues directly. So I think scientists engaging in those matters, getting in the fray, it will start to elevate the value of science. But I think when we get into these highly politicized words like climate change, then it gets a little trickier, and maybe we need to give some breathing room for those bigger terms. And then I'll speak to that notion of, I'm sorry, I forgot your name with the Mac, Kate. And this probably shows my complete naivete with academia and suicide of your career and all that, because I'm sort of fearless, I guess. And so I don't think about the consequences of my actions often, as my mother will argue is probably the most accurate statement. But I personally think if you see your science being misrepresented, or if people are taking partial truths or nuanced pieces of the science to represent something, and then ultimately you end up with inaccuracy, that's a huge issue because it's devaluing science. And then I'm having to deal with people in Wyoming saying, hey, the scientists aren't even agreeing, or hey, this science said this 5 minutes ago in some publication and now it says something different. And I'll, going back to the analogy point, give up a really quick example, the Cecil the lion thing we all heard about. I work very closely with the hunting community. I'm on a federal advisory committee called the Wildlife and Hunting Heritage Conservation Council. Ironic, I was a vegetarian and the biggest bunny squeeze you would ever meet. But all of my hunting lobby clients immediately started blasting me with this, oh my God, they don't understand hunting. We've got to get ahead of the hunting. I said, no, shut your mouths. Don't say a word about the fact that there's no science behind naming animals, and yes, it was blah, blah, blah. I said, just shut your mouths about the hunting. Stop being defensive. What you need to simply say, it was an illegal hunt. It didn't follow the North American model of conservation, didn't abide by fair chase principles. We do not support illegal poaching, illegal hunting, and just stop the conversation. And I'm not suggesting you call people out if they're putting stuff into papers that was misrepresented, tweaked, et cetera, because I would imagine that's probably not a great thing to do for your career. But I think we do have to sort of clean up from within, and we have to make sure that things aren't being misrepresented to get media attention, to get play, because what you may get in the way of media attention on the coasts will blow up in your face in the center, and we're starting to see the Western governors have a lot of play right now in Congress, and I think we're going to see with the political shifts coming, my God, Boehner just left for God's sakes, but I think we're going to see some changes, and we're seeing that center of the country mobilize together, and so it's really important that we're not just playing messages to the coasts.
Scott, did you have, I think Scott had a comment about this question too, but I can.
At Climate Central is a independent and total non-advocacy group. That's really, really important to us, because as soon as we would start trying to advocate for in different political positions, we would totally lose half of the people, like who might actually be interested in the science. So we work really hard in trying to make sure that we do not appear to be advocates, and that and that's difficult. And one part of that is we have to be really careful about who we take funding from, and what the expectations of our funders are. And we have to stay away from any kind of opinions on any political positions at all. What we do is just stay focused completely on the scientific facts, like what does the science actually say, and then leave the political opinions to the reader. So for example, what we might do is we take projections from the IPCC, like the carbon emissions scenarios and their sea level rise projections from those different scenarios, and saying, okay, from these projections, if we continue emissions as business as usual with no cuts, sea level rise might hit 78 centimeters by the end of the century. If we make drastic cuts, the sea level rise might only hit 30 centimeters or whatever by the end of the century. And here's what it means. Here's what the 78 centimeters, here what 30 centimeters actually looks like. I mean, we don't put any political opinion on this. We just say this is how it is. Here are the buildings that are going to be flooded under each scenario. And then we let the readers and policymakers make their choice on which scenario they would prefer to see.
And I was just going to add, sometimes I feel like it's tough not being an advocate, because it's just pulling at you all the time. But what I've gotten into with a lot of agriculturalists, they're really hard to speak to, and especially in Tennessee, is we've just been working with something called climate smart agriculture. So it has to do with the fact that we have climate change all the time. We always have problems going on with droughts, excessive rain, hail, excessive heat, etc. We don't, coach it with, we're going to have more of this or less of this in the future. But just the fact that, we need to be climate resilient now, because we already have a lot of climate issues going on. And, that kind of communication message seems to be better received than just oh my gosh, all these awful things are going to happen, you better be ready. So sometimes, you feel almost like a traitor when you do that, but, you got to make it work. You got to get the message out any way you can.
I have one thing to chime in. I think it's important that we are involved in the conversation. I think studying primarily evolution, and there's lots of opportunities to get into debates about evolution versus creationism or intelligent design, and we try to sort of stay away from that. And there's a great movie called Flock of Dodos, which sort of comments on that. But in regards to climate change, we have a real opportunity, I think, to frame the discussion. And there is the study that came out of Yale about who are sort of, the 5 or 6 Americas, and they looked at who the people are and the faces of them and the demographics of them. And it was really interesting because there was a large group that was accepting of climate change and sort of saying, okay, this is what I'm trying to do, we're accepting, and this, what can I do more of? And then there was these other groups that sort of were a little bit more on the fence and asking questions. What can I do, or how is this going to affect me? And those are questions we're actually not talking about. We're not answering, how is this going to affect me and what can I do? We're sort of trying to demonstrate that climate change is happening, and we're only addressing the question that's posed by less than 10%, which are the climate deniers. So if we actually reframe that discussion and answer the questions that most Americans are asking, we might actually acquire a vast majority of Americans who are thinking about climate change and accepting of climate change. So we are sort of constantly responding to the questions being asked by that less than 10%. I think it might be even 8 or 9%. And the whole debate is answering their questions, as opposed to us sort of stepping up ahead of the game and saying, here are the questions we're going to answer. We want to answer the questions of that middle group and that other group that's saying, what do I do? How is this going to affect me? Why should I care? And if we did that, we might get the whole majority.
I'm going to play the role of the campus idiot that both amplify something and disagree. As an evolutionary biologist and a mathematician, I'm already perceived as an advocate when I walk in the room. You can't ignore it. It comes with the territory kind of thing. But I do feel that the obligation is, in interpreting what Barbara and Katherine said, to amplify it in a different way in terms of knowing your audience. So frequently I talk to groups like creationist groups, Future Farmers of America, 4-H groups, etc., and they frequently, you represent these evil words, like mathematics and evolution kind of stuff, and I think my first rule is to appreciate them as an audience. What are they doing? Whether it's the loggers, the farmers, whatever kind of stuff, and thank them literally for their occupations of what they're contributing to your public civility and whatever kind of thing, of they're putting the food in your mouth, the clothes on your back, the wood in your house, etc. kind of stuff. And starting with that I too am concerned about maintaining their ranch, their family farm, their kids' health, etc. That these are the issues that unify us as scientists with you as other kinds of citizens. And I want to make a case against the science approach of just the facts. No, we're all filtering them. But we can't avoid the imperialisms of language that we're used to using as shorthand, of saying, the results indicate, research shows, etc. Show the research. Show the data. Don't do the imperial pummeling of your audience that you come from on high and that you too must believe what we believe kind of thing. Give them the benefit of looking at trajectories and data and so on kind of thing, and that we're dealing with this together. But I really feel one can be an advocate explicitly, but you come to it with humility, and that you're there as a public servant to serve their interests of their family, their community, so on. So I urge you to look at a book called Evolution in Your Backyard, of how an evolutionary biologist in Binghamton, New York, built pro-sociality motives into his community. That how do we use our profession and what we have learned to build this conversation in a different way. So, and I think particularly, Joanne, with your students, it's for them to understand that if you understand that many of these business people, they know how to make a pitch, they know how to sell, but what is it that you're interacting with them in that kind of common kind of language. So, but I really urge that we can't hide behind just the facts as some kind of vanilla. We are advocates, but we can do it in terms of we are also members of that same citizenry that they are.
I want to make one comment following what Barbara said and also what John said in terms of careers. Having been a provost and everything else up to that particular point, I always advocated with faculty members, wait until you get tenure. Once you have tenure, you can say anything you want to. You can be as strong an advocate, as big a risk taker as ever. But trust me, if you take on too much, particularly from the ideologue, imperial vantage point, prior to tenure, it will cost you in the long run. And so as much as I believe in advocacy and as much as I believe in getting our point out there and working with other people, it is critical to realize at this point in your career, your first goal may be to get tenure. If you don't like the school you're at, do anything you want. But if you really would like to get tenure, then be careful. I mean, it's, the same admonition I've given to both my kids, as Barbara pointed out. Be a risk taker, but in moderation, depending on what your ultimate goals are and what the consequences of taking the risks are. You don't walk out in front of an automobile because you want to prove that you can do it, for example.
So it's very interesting to me to hear from the panel all these ideas of we try to avoid being seen as advocates, we try to avoid making political statements because I grew up as the son of my father, Carlos Castillo Chavez, and he's built a research career essentially out of being aggressively political. Pretty much the opposite of a lot of the advice I've been hearing. So when he speaks on his panel, I think that's tomorrow, that might be a point of discussion, something that's worth talking about.
I wanted to see if, yeah.
No, but the question, instead of getting to climate change, because obviously it's an issue that that dominates the politics now, and it just makes it very difficult to have any discussion with people that don't want to actually look at the data. It just makes it almost impossible to have a conversation. So I'll give you a different example for epidemics. It has to do with vaccinations and autism, for example, right? So the general idea is people, there are, for example, doctors in California and things like that, that they have been in NPR and things like that. They argue that, that they should have a choice and there's actually a risk for vaccines. And in other words, they model some facts with some truths. But in the case of autism, there has been the study that seemed to indicate that was the case has been completely proven to be wrong. But this idea has stayed there, and when the use of mathematics goes in competition with what people want to believe or how it's going to affect their lifestyle or whatever, it's going to be very difficult to do that. But I think what the obligation that we have as teachers is to show students to the use of mathematical, what are the consequences if a larger and larger fraction of people don't get vaccinated. And I think in the case of climate change, it's not whether or not there is climate change, because that is a discussion that somebody doesn't want to believe you're not gonna make any progress. But if there were climate change, what would be the consequences associated with this? If there was so typically it's trying to use this as a way to make people think so that they can make their own decisions and provide as much information as they can. I think sometimes we advocate, and just because we are right, that doesn't mean that we are not advocating. And I think that the best way is to show conclusively, and this is the hard part about a lot of those things, because things like climate change and other things, so many nonlinear interactions take place into that. It's so really difficult to do that. That's why there is a lot of debate about some people that, that if they find a little piece of data, like just recently, there are some discooler areas that have come up, that immediately say, aha, I told you, this is not happening, it's going exactly in the other direction. But I think rather than that, just trying to figure out how do you actually show people to may think about what about the consequences of this, and once they understand that, they little by little, as they learn more science and things like that, some of them are going to reach the conclusions that that might be the most reasonable ones given the science that we have today.
You have a comment?
Hello. It sounds like what I'm hearing from a lot of people is we often have things that are so complicated that we can't just say them. And I was actually really interested because, Scott, you mentioned that you have a lot of interactive tools online. And I think this would be great if we as mathematicians collaborate with computer scientists to make interactive applets or apps and use these to communicate so people can see things that do arise from the models and actually play with them themselves. So to bring it back to interdisciplinary, I think it shouldn't just be math and bio, it should be math, bio, computer science, design to reach out in these ways.
Well, I just wanted to follow on, especially to what John was saying, and think about how we approach people. Because first of all, I like that idea that we are just naturally advocates. Everybody is to a certain extent, but that we're also not objective. Like, I think we need to just put that idea to bed. People are not objective. We all filter data and results through our own filtering system, as much as we want to think that that's not true. And I think actually the vaccine example is a good one, because there are a lot of really, highly educated, progressive people who very much believe that in that connection that's been disproven. And I also think that we have to be respectful of our audience. I think we approach it a lot of times trying to say, we come at it in a way that we're thinking, okay, they're wrong and I'm right, and I somehow have to respectfully prove to them how wrong they are. When the truth is that, science, we have to be a little humble. There are many, many historical examples of how wrong science has been. And we need to acknowledge the fact that we may find out about things that we're going to be wrong about in the future. And so we need to approach people respectfully and realize that they're not stupid, and a lot of times the problem is one of trust, not intelligence. You can show them all the data you want, you can show them all the models you want. If they don't trust you, they're not going to believe them, and why should they? So I think that those are really important things that we always need to be keeping in mind as we're talking to anybody.
Any final comments from the panel? Scott?
So going off of that, I think there is a really important distinction between the advocacy of, for example, climate change, the importance of climate change, because at Climate Central we don't hide the fact that that we believe in climate change and how important it is. But there is a distinction between that and like the political advocacy. That's where it gets dangerous, because as soon as you start talking about specific, bills or specific policies, you'll just immediately be labeled as a liberal or whatever, and half the country is going to shut you off. On the other hand, if you stick with the science, even if you are advocating specific ideas in the sciences, it was mentioned earlier that only a small percentage of people will just completely ignore. Maybe 10% or so will say that there's a crazy conspiracy between the millionaire scientists who want to get those grants, but the much larger group of people we find at Climate Central are those people who do believe in climate change, but they don't really care. They have doctor bills to worry about. They have they want to put their kids through college, and they say, well, climate change might affect my grandchildren, but why should my taxes go up on things that are going to happen 50 or 100 years from now? And so what we really try to focus on are the number one, keeping it local. And that means what are the impacts in your direct area? What does it mean for your house or your hospital or your school? And then keeping it focused on the impacts in the much near, as near term as possible, as early as 2030 or 2050, or even now, what the effects of climate change are today. Yeah, that's what I think is a great strategy, is really focusing on those impacts that really affect people and keeping it as local as possible to get people, that middle group, that really large middle group, to help them understand why they should care about what's happening to the earth.
And I was just going to mention, I know I've had some students make comments about this lately, because most of my students are middle, upper income Caucasians, and now they're being asked more and more to get messages out to folks that are not like them, lower income, from people of different ethnicities, and they find that they're struggling with that. They're not really sure, exactly how to change the message or, make it more relevant, as you were saying, to that community. Weatherization's been a big program we've been working in, and just making that super relevant and connected to climate change, the fact that they can lower their utility bills, by actually helping the climate too. So I think that's something we all need to look towards, is, there's a lot of environmental justice issues out there. These communities should be very concerned, but sometimes, as you say, they're just worried about the day-to-day existence, and it's hard to break through with the message.
I mentioned humor earlier, and I just want to bring that back again. Humor can be really divisive. I mean, you've probably seen shared on Facebook the, ha, look at how stupid these people who don't believe vaccines help or that they cause autism are. They just don't know anything. And that's not building the trust you mentioned. I think it's sort of on us to make sure we use something like that in productive ways to really build the trust, because it can deflate so much of the baggage we bring with us to these issues.
I guess one thing we also want to think about is sort of balancing our approach, both as top-down and bottom-up. And so the top-down is really focusing on adults today, and the bottom-up focusing on the next generation. And there is some point where things change, because most kids care about the earth, the environment, and animals. And there's often sort of there's something that happens. And I know people are studying at which point you have this shift. There's also lots of studies on trying to keep younger students and also females and minorities in STEM disciplines. But some combination of an approach I think is really important. But we do need to sort of really look also to this next generation and try to provide them with the skills and infuse these examples about, I love that idea of what will happen if all of the ice melts, and I want to do that with my students. But I could see that happening in every elementary school or middle school, and students starting to figure this out and think about, okay, what are the consequences? But if we really fundamentally sort of, yes, address the adults around today, but also really think about that next generation, making them equipped to sort of answer these questions, but also more generally trying to foster that compassion for the earth and understanding of it, then hopefully we can sort of make some changes.
I guess I'll just build on that comment. I think to pass along, something else to pass along to that younger generation is an awareness of the media and developing a media literacy. And so being able to look at how quantitative data is reported, is it accurate in news headlines? Have patterns been inferred where there really aren't any? Misuse of numbers, that kind of thing. Just having those conversations, being able to have that in the classroom, I think is a valuable skill as well.
I'm anxiously waiting for the break because I'm going to charge at John and give him a huge hug. It's John, right? Because he did such a phenomenal job of saying what I was doing a really bad job of saying. But I'll hammer back on this concept of audience analysis. And I think if you go through that exercise of audience analysis and you look at, particularly starting from the perspective of your detractors, you would find out, as I'm sure John has probably seen in his own work, that for me in the rural West, my greatest advocates for climate change, though we don't call it climate change, are ranchers. Ranchers have lived in the West. They're basically descendants of homesteaders. They have spent hundreds of years on the land. They know more about changes that are occurring on that land than any of us collectively put together in all of our models. And ranchers, once you spend this time getting to know people, come to the place where they are, getting to know their frame of reference and doing this audience analysis, you'll realize we have advocates that are not necessarily educated, and they're not our typical folks to carry this message, but they're probably much better people to carry that message on our behalf. So thank you, John, so much. Like I said, I just want to run at you and give you a huge hug. But
all right, well, before that big hug happens and before you all charge out of here for lunch, first I want to thank our distinguished panel. I know they got a good conversation going with us.